Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for everybody who's taken their time out of their day to come today. I can't tell you how much it means to the mental health work stream. There have been hours upon hours of blood, sweat and tears go into this particular report. Namely, Ali and Adriana really carrying a huge part of it. Ed has absolutely stormed through and make it look like the beauty that it is. But there will be thank yous through here. I mean, we couldn't have done it without the people who've actually contributed. So the companies who've taken part, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. It's so good to be able to create and share something like this with everybody in this room, but of course across the industry. So I wanted to start with thank yous. I should have started with who I am, which is what I'm going to do now. My name's Jaya. I was, until very recently, one of the co-leads on the mental health work stream, and I did it for quite a few years. It started off around COVID time, and it was such an apt time for it to get involved. There are people who've been there from before I even joined. Peter, for example, was one of the original members of the work stream that's been going on for about 3 years now. And it was such a fantastic opportune time for us to talk about the things that come with mental health, that are because of mental health. And I think it was a topic that really touched everybody's hearts during the lockdown period in particular. I mean, the numbers are stark, they're there. It has impacted so many lives, whether directly or indirectly. Everybody, and I say this time and time again, has mental health, whether it's good, whether it's bad on some days. You have mental health, and to look after it and to look after your employees' mental health is so important. It doesn't end there. I've spoken also about in the past how mental health is so incredibly intersectional. If you look at some of the work streams that we have at the Diversity Project, we've got menopause, veterans, we have disability, and that's just to name a few. There's over 15 different work streams as far as I'm aware, and mental health does touch every single one of them. I would say it's the most intersectional of them all. So we've taken our time, we've worked with the likes of neurodiversity work stream in the past and the menopause work stream not too long ago, and smart working too, which all of us have had to obviously make the change in our lives when it came to the hybrid working model. So there is opportunity there if you're part of another work stream to reach out to the co-leads and get involved. We can do and create more things just like this report in the future, and that is the hope. This is the first of many more things to come, and I really hope you continue to stay engaged with us, get involved. If you're not already part of the work stream, reach out to Caroline or Adriana, we'll get you involved. If you're not part of the Diversity Project yet and you've joined us, get involved. Speak to Adriana, reach out via LinkedIn to any of us, and we'll point you in the right direction, because there's so much value to be taken from some of the things that we've already created and we're yet to create. I'm just going to take a very quick moment to tell you a little bit about why this is important to me, and then I'll pass over to Lindsay, who's going to be hosting our first panel. This and our vision as the mental health work stream now is all about helping the employer be in the best position possible to work with their employees. Your employees are your biggest asset in the workplace. You've got so much that they can give, and if you look after them, they will look after you in the long run, because they are the people between you and your end customers. And I've actually never said this in a room full of strangers before, but in 2015, I survived a suicide attempt, and it was absolutely life-changing for me. I was in the worst place of my life, and I was going through several different jobs at the time. I was still sort of finishing off uni and figuring out where I wanted to be. And I, like others who will come after me, chose to work where I work today because of the support that was provided, because I believed that I would be well looked after should I need it, because that was the only way I was going to continue to A, be able to provide for my family, and B, be able to build the life that I wanted. I've always been very, very ambitious, and I didn't want that to stop me. So I chose somewhere that would fit me, but would also look after me. So there are people who are like me more and more these days, looking at these benefits straight away before they even look at the job application in detail. It's important to have these things in place, not just from a business-minded perspective, but also to be a good human. So that's enough of the intro. Thank you again so much for coming along. I'm going to pass along to Lindsay, who's going to introduce our panel and go through our first session of the day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jaya, and also thank you so much, Jaya, for providing us with a personal story. I think it's quite important when we talk about mental health to recognise this is about individuals, and this is about both prevention as well as kind of managing mental health conditions and challenges that everybody as individuals faces. So thank you so much for sharing, because I think it's really important to kind of bring this back to what this is all about. So that was Jaya. That is what we're going to be talking about today. I can't do this behind me. I should have stood, shouldn't I? So first of all, I just want to say thank you very, very much, in addition to Jaya's comments, to all of the contributors to the report. You will be able to download the report. We're sharing with you a QR code at the end of the session, and it will be emailed out to everyone from the Diversity Project, to all of our member firms. We would highly encourage you all to read this, and please do share both with colleagues and your wider network. So thank you very much. It was a huge amount of effort from everybody involved. And this is going to be us. So I would like to invite my two expert panelists. So we've got two panel sessions. The first one is with some expert speakers on mental health, and they're both bringing a very diverse perspective on thinking about what firms can be doing to improve their mental health and well-being provisions to employees. And both have provided some really interesting but very different benchmarks and frameworks for us to think about how we can kind of measure ourselves. And measurement is going to be a topic that comes up for sure. So please can I invite Amy and Alison to the stage. We have Amy here. Then I can. So, would you want to stand or sitting? It's entirely up to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you click forward. So Amy is going to give a little bit of a short introduction to CCLA, who's an investment manager. They provided a really interesting framework as a benchmark for industries, across industries. And then Alison is going to spend a few minutes introducing the City Mental Health Alliance as well, and their frame of reference. So off you go.
Thank you. So I'll just spend 5 minutes or less on this. So for those who don't know CCLA, we are an investment management company based in the UK, and we're the largest manager of charity investments. I think we manage money for something like 35,000 charities in the UK. Most of them are very, very small. Now, we have our roots in the 1950s, and so as you'd imagine, we have a very long history of investing what used to be ethically, so making sure that we didn't invest in things that contradicted with our clients' missions or values. But over recent decades, the focus has moved much more to what we can do with the companies once we are invested in them. How can we improve them? How can we make them better? Now, one of the things that CCLA aims to do, given the clients that we represent, is that where we identify a risk that we believe is system-wide, a systemic risk. So it applies to companies regardless of industry, regardless of geography. Then we aim to mobilize the investment community into action to tackle it. Now, one of those risks, it may not be a surprise to learn, we believe is mental ill health in the workplace. Now, particularly relevant to employers, of course. Deloitte does a lot of amazing work on this, but just to pick out a couple of stats, we find that mental ill health in the workplace costs employers, on average, about £1,600 for every single employee every year in the private sector. But probably more interestingly, employers have found an average return of £5.30 for every £1 invested in mental health interventions. Now, that is a hell of a return on invested capital and something that any leader, frankly, would be quite stupid to ignore. So as investors, how do we bring this message to life? How do we get companies to sit up and listen and get them to approach mental health with the same sort of framework that they might approach physical health in the workplace? Because frankly, it's as relevant. So CCLA has essentially spent the last 2 years building a framework, one of several frameworks, and we're obviously going to talk about another one in a minute, aimed at assessing and comparing some of the world's largest listed companies on their approach to mental health in the workplace. Now, this importantly takes a company's public disclosures and ranks them on a tiering system, and I'll show you in a second. But really, the objective is twofold. The first is to strengthen the hand of people within organizations who are trying to make headway. So there may be people within organizations who know that we need to invest more money in mental health, but they haven't got the senior management buy-in. They can't release the money that they know that they need. And the second was to mobilize the investment community into action to tackle this problem. So what's the outcome? So we launched, we can go into how we assess companies later on, perhaps in the panel, but essentially we assess companies against 27 assessment criteria, having mapped all of the existing frameworks on mental health that we could find. So 27 assessment criteria across 4 broad areas. And then we launched the 2 benchmarks last year. A UK benchmark on the left, we launched in May, and a global benchmark on the right. Now, these are the 100 largest listed companies in the UK and in the world with more than 10,000 employees. Now, the companies listed there between them employ more than 24 million people across the world. So it is a huge amount of impact, potentially, if this gets off the ground. Now, apart from anything else, I mean, one thing we've learned is that positive peer pressure is a wonderful thing. And companies are really, really aware of their score, but particularly their score against their own direct peers. So finally, we have built the support. We have launched a global investor statement on workplace mental health, which now has the support of 44 signatories with a combined $8.5 trillion in assets under management, which allows us, when we write to these companies, to say this is not just the voice of CCLA, but this is the voice of the investment industry, and we need you to listen. That's all I had to say up front, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. Okay, thank you for that. Now, Alison, CEO of the City Mental Health Alliance, would you like to, you can stay seated, because I know you don't have any slides. We're going to get rid of that very hot back screen and move on to that. This keeps you warm. No, it's all right. There you go.
Lovely. Well, hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon. For those of you who are not familiar with the City Mental Health Alliance, we're a membership organisation. We were set up probably 12, 13 years ago now by 3 senior business leaders, one from Linklaters law firm, KPMG and Goldman Sachs. And these 3 senior business leaders were having a conversation about the increasing levels of stress they were seeing within their organisations. But nobody was talking about it. You know, mental health, there was a huge amount of stigma. Even though the D&I agenda was really progressing, nobody was really willing to speak up and talk about mental health. And obviously, this had, implications for the business. It had implications in terms of, the human aspect and employee welfare. It also had implications for the business in terms of client service. So they essentially brought together a group of leaders, and that is how the Alliance started. So officially, we are 10 years old, and we now have 35 members in the UK and just under 80 members globally, predominantly financial and professional services organisations. And we work with organisations to help them. So we're not a passive organisation. We don't pump out content, but we're also not consultants. We don't go into organisations. We work with organisations together as a network to really set the standards for what looks good in workplace mental health. Now, I would say in 10 years, there's been a huge shift in workplace mental health. I think the pandemic has, in the last few years really driven some of that, and it is one of the more positive things, I would say, to come out of the pandemic, that more and more organisations are really thinking about well-being. But the responsibility of well-being, I think, has really shifted from being an individual responsibility to now being a responsibility of the business. And what we're also hearing and seeing is that the infrastructure within the UK in terms of health service and mental health service provision is not adequate to deal with the demand. And just as a result of the pandemic, we've seen a 25 plus increase in people with anxiety and depressive related symptoms. So there is a big problem, and actually a lot of people now are turning to their employers to access the support they need. So it's imperative that organisations are talking about these issues, and that people within those organisations, have the skills and the confidence to have healthy conversations and to signpost people to help. Now, in terms of the work that we do, so we have events and we have guidance and all those sorts of things, but I think probably most relevant today is our assessment. And essentially, we have an annual assessment that we run across our UK and also globally with organisations, and it's linked to our Thriving at Work framework. So if any of you are really thinking about, well, how do I structure my organisational strategy? Where do I start? Then please do take a look at those guides. They are accessible through our website. But essentially the way it's structured is we have sort of 3 key pillars. So we look at a culture. So we look at how is your organisation prioritising well-being. Now, I think if we spoke to anyone in your organisation, of course, everyone would agree, yes, of course, mental health and well-being is important. But to what extent is it being prioritised? Is it being embedded into your organisational strategy? Are your senior leaders really talking about this as an organisation? And then thinking about psychological safety. To what extent can people speak up and speak, freely and trust the organisation and trust that they will get the right support if they need it? We also then look at workplace. That's the second pillar. So how are you embedding good mental health practices in your business as usual operations? So thinking about the employee life cycle. So how are you embedding good practice from the moment of attraction all the way through to exit, the working environment, the kind of role of the line leader and how important they are in terms of determining the day-to-day experiences of your people. And then lastly, we'll look at support. So we look at how are you opening the dialogue? How are you engaging different groups across your organisation? Because I think this is a really relevant point that was made by Jay at the beginning around the intersectionality. Mental health isn't, binary. We all come with our own experiences of mental health, and there'll be certain elements, I suppose, of our experiences and who we are, whether that's our gender, our race, our sexual orientation, that will impact our mental health. So it's thinking about how are we opening up the dialogue and those conversations with different groups across the organisation. And lastly, how are you offering support? So how are you supporting your employees? What sits underneath, and I won't go into all the detail of it, but what sits underneath those pillars is what we call the organisational elements. So we have 10 standards, and sitting underneath that is around 150 to 180 criteria that we measure organisations on. So the benefit of the assessment, it's a confidential exercise. We do that with businesses really to help them identify the gaps against the kind of standards that we've set across the Alliance, and it is an evidence-based framework. And we help businesses to really sort of plug the gaps and really think about what they're doing. But most importantly, I think this is around helping businesses to really embed good practice across all sort of business functions. And there are just a few themes I just kind of wanted to pick up in terms of what we've seen over the last 10 years. So, mental health is very much a strategic priority for most of our member organisations. And, we are seeing a huge amount of organisations have very active senior leadership. So at the very top, we are seeing that level of commitment. Mental health and wellbeing is being socialised across these organisations. There's a whole raft of activities, and I'm sure many of you are doing those within your organisation. So the conversations are happening within the workplace, which is really important. The majority of organisations do offer some access to support. Now, it may be through an EAP, it may be through on-site counselling, various ways. But the most important thing is there are now, avenues for people to access support. And that we are now starting to see that organisations are starting to integrate it into practices and policies and systems and business as usual. In terms of the leading organisations, though, what I would say we are seeing is this increasing level of accountability. So organisations starting to build this into their job descriptions, their values, their competencies. And probably the ones that really are the front runners are now building it into kind of competency frameworks, which is quite a complex thing to do. But it is showing that an organisation thinks this is so important that they are going to link it to, line leader accountability and compensation. And there's a really good analogy that I heard someone talk about. They talk about it's quite easy to put in the hardware to do the initiatives, the sort of events and activities. The challenge for organisations is really about the software. It's about the leadership, the culture and the behaviours within the organisation. And that is where we're seeing the difference between what a good organisation is doing to one that we consider to be on their way to health creating. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've probably taken more than 5 minutes. So
That's quite right. You've covered a lot in that, Alison, so thank you. So hopefully you'll get a sense that we've got kind of some two very complementary sets of expertise here. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. Because your point about accountability and measurability is a really, really valid one. And Amy, you obviously kind of said, theoretically, you've got a fantastic return on investment here. So why wouldn't you? So and actually, there's a quote in our report that you'll read from Paul McGregor, who's from Every Mind at Work, who says, the what is all very, well, I'm paraphrasing clearly because it's a much more eloquent quote, but he was kind of saying you can do all the what, but that doesn't really count for anything if you haven't figured out what your why is. So I kind of wanted to come to you, Amy, to talk a little bit about, and you've defined to some extent what you think the why is, but then I want you to kind of share some thoughts, if you don't mind, about how we then think, or how firms can think about measurable factors, thinking about impact. Because I think, if firms are really going to commit to an investment here, they need to kind of know what they're going to get out of it, and then how do they measure that, and how do they measure success of that?
Yes, that's fine. Thanks. So I think that, now bearing in mind CCLA comes from a particular lens, which is we are investors, and so we are sort of stakeholders, but the way that we, the mechanism through which we receive information is through public disclosures. So we take in our benchmark, and it's slightly different to City Mental Health Alliance, but we take what's known as a management systems lens. So we're looking at, first of all, is there a commitment at the senior level? Is there a management commitment? Is there a policy? Is there a statement from the chief executive on the website? So top level management commitment. Then we look at the governance around that commitment. So there may be a policy, there may be this top-level commitment, but who is actually responsible for carrying out that policy on the ground? Like, who is actually going to make sure that policy gets carried out on a day-to-day basis? And does the company set objectives or targets for the management of mental health? Does it provide training for managers? And then I think the third most important area, which goes to your question, is on performance reporting and impact. So where a company provides or sets objectives and targets, does it then report on progress against those targets? Where it provides the hardware, the initiatives, does it then report on the uptake of those initiatives? It's all very well, bringing these amazing things out, but if no one's actually taking them up, it's a little bit like, to use a very basic analogy, serving up a whole load of broccoli to your child, but then not checking if they've eaten it. So it's these kinds of things. And also, if you have a mental health policy, also setting KPIs, key performance indicators, to ensure that you're tracking how successful that policy is over time, which then allows you to adapt to the changing needs of your workforce as it changes over time.
So those are some of the measures that you're looking at, measurable factors, I should say, that you're thinking about. And then, Alison, from your perspective, the conversations that you're having with internal teams, what are the measures that they're looking at? Are they different? And then I think I'd like to kind of share a discussion around disclosure and, what things should be disclosed to external stakeholders and others. So your thoughts from an internal perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think data is, it's an ongoing challenge, even for the organisations that have been really thinking about this for a long time, because I suppose there isn't one set of data that's going to give you all the information you need. So I think what we're seeing is that organisations are looking at lots of different sets of data to try and come up with a picture. Now, that data may be HR-related information, so, the absence data, maybe work utilisation, holidays taken. Some are now looking at metrics around kind of, I suppose, ways of working, so looking at, emails and times and, how people are working, which is quite interesting, and that comes onto some of the privacy pieces as well. Utilisation, I mean, many of you may have lots of service providers around wellbeing, so what information can you get from those service providers can be really informative. And then the other thing that we've started to see, I mean, and obviously there's benchmarking, which is obviously incredibly useful, but the other thing we've started to see, and I think it's still in that kind of test phase, is biometric information. So, where, and there's been a couple of our members who've done some really interesting work around looking at people's sleep patterns. If I'm sort of getting quite tense, my watch will tell me to be mindful. So I think, there's obviously these data in these apps that can sort of, I suppose, measure and track how people are, their blood pressure and what's sort of happening throughout the day. And one of these organisations actually looked at biometric data and also asked the question at the start of this particular pilot, well, let's think about your ways of working and let's think about actually how we can make that better. And actually we're able to show and demonstrate that actually through changes in ways of working, people actually were performing better, sleeping better, and felt they had more resilience. So it's a very emerging area. And I would say another thing to look at actually is Indeed, because Indeed have been working with the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre, and they are collecting it's the world's largest wellbeing study. So I would take a look, because actually organisations, including maybe some of your own, will have wellbeing metrics, applied to them based on employee sentiment, which is the last group of kind of data inputs that organisations are collecting to get that sense of how their employees are feeling around their own individual wellbeing, but also some of the actions that the organisations are taking.
Just a follow-up question. Where are you finding member firms kind of having success with internal voice surveys or staff surveys? Is that a useful mechanism? Are people being honest enough? Is that providing a useful feedback mechanism? I know there's various views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had much feedback around people not trusting organisations now. I think it's become quite commonplace to ask questions around wellbeing. I think the challenge is, our wellbeing changes on a day-to-day basis and may even fluctuate throughout the day. So it's finding a way to have that kind of continuous feedback with employees, and also what is the right question that we should be asking. There's lots of questions you can ask, but what is the right one to really get that, to really understand that sentiment? Very simply, things like Net Promoter Score type questions can be very useful, because actually people really think about, well, would I recommend my employer on the basis of well-being to a friend? And actually that can be a really useful way of doing it. But yeah, it's still emerging, and nobody's got the sort of secret sauce as such on data.
Interesting. And so data for internal use is one thing, but then data to provide out to external stakeholders such as yourselves is another one. Do you have challenges with accessing the right quality of data? What can we do better as firms to kind of help stakeholders?
First of all, you don't want to be disclosing anything that's sensitive. Mm-hmm. And often companies will say, well, we don't want to disclose any of this stuff. It's private information and it wouldn't be fair. But when we're looking at objectives or targets, an objective or a target can be something as simple as we aim to train all of our line managers this next calendar year on mental health. And then, of course, to report on whether you've achieved that. So the next year, we'd expect them to say, we set out to achieve 100%. We've managed to reach 90% of our managers this year. That's an objective. That's a target. And absolutely fully valid, I think. Some companies that we've assessed and in the benchmark do go as far as saying, employees have said that X% of our employees say that they are well, or X% access mental health services, and then report on whether that's gone up and down each year. But it's not necessary, and it won't be appropriate for all industries or all sectors, I think. Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about kind of getting senior leadership buy-in. There's a huge amount more publicly, certainly in weeks like this week, Mental Health Awareness Week, where everybody's being kind of vocal. How can we avoid lip service to mental health, if that's the right term? How can we avoid, and I think it is about these measurement accountability points, but, you will obviously kind of see the outside lens, and if anyone else kind of looking at a firm from outside in will see the same. What do we need to make sure that it's being properly applied?
Well, I was going to say, can I just go back a couple of...
Yeah, go for it.
Well, just because if we just look at the 4... Oh, no, sorry, lost it. This one. Okay. So there are 4 areas that we assess. Now, the first one, management commitment and policy, arguably it's quite easy to just tick those boxes. But if a company scores full points in that section, but doesn't score in any of the others, then they're not going to actually do very well overall. So I think the whole point of framing the benchmark in this way is to ensure that you can't just throw out a policy and then be done with it. You've got to show follow through and reporting and continual improvement.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think accountability is key. And I mean, I think, this benchmark, for example, hopefully it will grow and more organisations, will become more involved and care more about it. Because I know it's relatively new, because I think, having your name listed, on a public listing and perhaps not being in one of the top tiers, will bother CEOs. I think at the moment, again, it's important but not a priority to my organisation. The other challenge, I think, and there are some really big stats out there, and from Deloitte and, other organisations, but they're almost slightly meaningless to some of these leaders because, well, I'm not seeing it coming off my P&L. I'm not seeing the cost to my business necessarily. And I think that's the challenge when you don't have adequate data to demonstrate that. It's, okay, well, if your IT system was broken and it was costing you millions of pounds, you'd fix it. But they're not necessarily seeing well-being as an investment. All of these initiatives and interventions are seen more as a cost that sit, under the kind of banner of HR. So I think in time, and I think, the work that CCLA and others are doing is really going to demonstrate that. And I, again, would say watch out for the report coming from Oxford and the Wellbeing Research Centre, because there is some really interesting stuff around organisational performance and well-being and the correlation between the two. It's that sort of stuff that we're starting to see, which will hopefully start to make more of a difference.
Well, I guess it's about capturing the people that are perhaps not your member firms who haven't found their why yet, to use Paul's reference. Are there any particular themes that kind of have driven any particular successes of the member firms that you've worked with? Obviously, you've got your kind of tiering system. Any particular themes that you think have really driven the success, whether it's that senior stakeholder, whether there's something around the cultures, they've all got a similar kind of look, feel. You've obviously looked across industries, and obviously you're working, Alison, within the city-based firms. Anything that you'd like to kind of draw out?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the most powerful things is storytelling. And I think it means a huge amount when you've got particularly senior leaders being very open and sharing their own stories, of mental ill health, of, mental ill health recovery. And I would say over the course of our 10 plus years, that has been probably the most important thing, because we are human beings. And of course we intuitively understand the business case. Of course, it makes sense. People are well, they're going to perform better, and that's better for the business. But actually, I think sometimes it comes back to us being human, and, so many of us are touched by mental ill health, whether it's, our own personal experience or that of somebody close to us. So I think that's probably one of the most important things. Obviously, the pandemic has been a huge shift in terms of thinking. The other thing I would just say is early careers cohorts. Now, the prevalence of mental ill health amongst, younger people now starting their careers has gone up quite significantly. We could have a huge debate on perhaps why that may be, but organisations, a lot of our members are now saying, well, we're having to really think about how we're approaching work, how we're communicating, particularly in this hybrid environment, how we look after people joining the organisation. There is an emerging children's mental health crisis going on at the moment that has not... There's been a huge shift. So it's gone from 1 in 9 to 1 in 6 children from 2017 to 2020. Those numbers are increasing of children requiring mental health support. They are going to be entering the workplace in the next 5 or so years. So there is a bit of a burning platform around organisations really needing to be ready and able to look after new people joining.
The only thing, the main thing that comes to mind is, again, initiatives. It's the difference between hardware and software. I loved that one. So, and actually, we saw when we were engaging with 100 companies during the beginning of the pandemic, there were no end of initiatives going out to support people. But well-meaning initiatives. So these companies and the leaders really knew that there was a need out there and heightened psychological distress, and they were really trying to help. But initiatives without a strategy is like shooting into space. And no end of free fruit or yoga sessions or wellness sessions is going to make up for a lack of fair pay, financial security. Companies, and we go back, and this actually goes back to the principles, the basic principles of good work: financial fair pay, financial well-being, flexible working, employee consultation, information, anti-bullying and non-harassment, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these things a company needs to get right for a person to be a thriving and productive member of the workforce.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left of our session, so I wanted to ask if anyone wanted to throw out any questions to our panellists. I've got others myself, but who wants to go first? I'm going to fight over the mic. There you go. Thank you. Does it work? On?
Hi, sorry.
There you go.
It was lovely to hear your thoughts on just the work that's coming out, so thank you for that. My question is just off the last point that, Amy, you've made. You would think that it's actually natural to have all the elements of, as you said, in a strategy to support the initiatives, because that's how it should be. Why is it that we haven't gotten that right yet?
To be honest, if we're looking at, when we were scoring companies across the 6 areas of good work, there was a quite a clear performance differential in the areas that we'd seen a crisis in recently. So I'm making assumptions here, but I absolutely think that the higher score in things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and companies being aware of the link between that and good mental health, was probably caused, or at least sparked, catalyzed by the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm pretty certain that had we done that assessment before, companies probably wouldn't have scored so well. You look at flexible working was another really high-performing one, and actually, we've just had a pandemic, and companies now know that that's a valuable, supportive measure of people's mental health. And just to give you a little bit of a preview, so we've done the UK assessments again for the UK benchmark, which will be launched on the 5th of June, so in a few weeks' time. So we have all the results, and one teaser, if you like, is that actually companies have suddenly done a lot better on fair pay and financial well-being given the cost of living crisis that we're facing. So I'd say crises are often what it takes.
Love a good
I'm
crisis.
afraid. Yeah, love a good crisis.
Thank you. Akash? Sorry. Go on, Samira. Yeah.
It's on.
There you go.
Thank you very much for that. I'm very much looking forward to the report, and thank you for signposting the one coming out with the wellbeing research in Oxford and Indeed. The nerd in me is like, yes. But we're speaking a lot about ways in which people work to help improve mental health. And I'm going to disclose my bias. I'm a burnout expert, so I see everything through that lens. And I think the mental health crisis around stress is with burnout, but we keep putting initiatives that help people run down when they're exhausted and fatigued, which is completely different. And so my question is, how much are we taking into account the other factors that is actually their personal lives? So I think we could argue that our working life is probably the most quantifiable part of our life. The only area that we do get measured where we can have benchmarks, but that's often a manifestation of the symptoms of people feeling disempowered and exhausted, anxious and depressed in their personal life. And we're just seeing the offset of that in the working world. And so yourself, Amy, you mentioned about fair pay, but we also know that when it comes to financial well-being, you can give someone an increase in pay, but if that comes with lifestyle inflation and mismanagement of their own money, or greater emphasis and focus on their pensions and how we can support people with pensions, but not acknowledging they're struggling with their present day money, how do we mirror and marry the need for the software staff, which is managing their own personal lives, so they can actually pick up and implement the tools that were given to them as an organisation to then excel in their careers and achieve sustainable success?
Shall I take this one? Well, I mean, I think it's a really good point, because I think, you know, there is a lot of focus around elements within the kind of working environment and the working relationship that we're focusing on. I think the best approaches are, you know, taken into consideration. I mean, you know, if you're developing a strategy and you're really thinking about, you know, where do I start, then the first thing is to talk about and to understand the needs of your people, because people will come with different experiences and different things that will be impacting their mental health. And you're quite right, it's not just the workplace that potentially can impact health, it's actually everything that goes on around us. And just a couple of examples. I mean, I think, you know, you have to build this into your program. So yes, it is how we approach work, it is leadership, it is culture. But if we're looking at that support pillar that I mentioned earlier, that's about how we're looking after people from diverse groups, how we're looking after people from vulnerable groups, how we're thinking about some of the issues. Financial well-being is one of them. You know, obviously, lots of people, well, we're all experiencing the cost of living crisis. Obviously, some people are, you know, more impacted than others. So lots of organisations putting in place different financial well-being education and measures to support people. There's things like menopause and reproductive health, and actually, you know, a lot of women experiencing menopause and the symptoms of that. Well, how are organisations helping women to get, you know, assessments and, you know, get the right medication? The other thing we're starting to see more organisations really start to think about is things like assessments for families. So lots of parents worried about children, mental health. It might be around getting a neurodivergent condition assessment. So I think there's lots of organisations are really stepping in. And, you know, to this point I made at the beginning around the NHS and the infrastructure, actually a lot of us don't have access to the right, you know, support and advice. And I think employers are now playing a bigger role, which will, for those individuals who need it, have a huge impact on their well-being. So absolutely, it's all in, you know, I think it's not just one thing. I think there's lots of elements that organisations need to think about.
Thank you, Alison. I'm going to be really rude and go over time and let Akash just ask one very short question, if you can.
You talked about disclosures. Would you be in favour of mandatory disclosures, a sort of TMHFD for those familiar with the acronyms in the industry?
I don't know, what's that acronym? What?
There's a task force for climate-related financial disclosures.
Yes.
And
I know about that one.
So there's MH for mental health.
I think there's a place for it. I know that there's a movement towards mandatory disclosure for companies. I think you'd have to be very careful about what you're asking companies to disclose. And any examples I've seen of sort of lobbying groups, the move was towards disclosing the happiness level of the company, essentially, which I'd have certain problems with for certain reasons, because actually, really, our starting point is that, and this goes back to your point, actually, that, you know, mental ill health is a fact of life, and there are all sorts of pressures on a person's life. It does not, any mental ill health, mental illness doesn't just come from their work. There are all sorts of other things. So, you know, this is a fact of life, and the need will be there at any point in time. So I think a disclosure of a certain sort, be it the management commitment, the governance, reporting against performance or objectives, I would be fully in favour of. Yes, that's what we're trying to simulate here.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. May I ask everyone to thank our panellists? And I'm now going to hand over to Ed, not Ed, sorry, I saw Ed and thought just said your name out loud. I'm going to hand over to Ali, who's going to bring up some of our contributors to the report. Thank you.
Sorry.